All right. Good morning, Doug. The headlines are coming in so fast these days that it's impossible for us to cover everything that's going on in the world. But I do want to get to the issue with this mass shooting. And we should talk about the new Speaker of the House, the new savior, the guy who's going to bring the country together, ordained by God, in fact. But first, let's do what we normally do and get into some what you learned in Encyclopedia Britannica.
Well, I learned something new from Encyclopedia Britannica, as you should, every day, but it's basically trivia that I'm learning from the encyclopedia. Uh, and there's so much of that. I mean, how are we going to get this stuff all in? First thing that I'd note is that it wasn't today, but it was a couple days ago, in 1945, that the UN was founded. And of course, that's one of the great disasters of modern history. People can say, well, isn't it nice that the nations of the world can all get together and talk to each other? But the fact of the matter is, it's not really the nations of the world talking to each other. It's selected bureaucrats to get a really cushy post to hang out in New York City and live high off the hog, talking to other people like themselves. They don't do anything important. In fact, anything they do is unimportant and instructive. Uh, kind of in celebration of the fact, I looked up what the UN costs the US, because the US pays about a third of its budget. And what's the answer to that question? It's the UN costs the US about $12.5 billion per year, and the UN has about 45,000 employees. But then I saw another number, probably including associated agencies that aren't directly UN, 125,000. And it's really almost as bad as the European community in Brussels, which directly employs 50,000 people. So these
Well, I mean, you
bureaucrats.
think I'm sure that 12.5 billion number doesn't cover like things like the WHO. I'm sure that that's a different line item budget for us.
No, no,
But that's because of the UN, right? It wouldn't exist if the UN didn't exist.
yeah, that's right. I'm sure these numbers are all mishmashed and mingled and so forth. We don't really know. But my answer to the question is the UN should be abolished. But if it's not abolished, the US should withdraw from the UN, because the UN is increasingly, through the use of treaties, which supersede US law. Treaty that the US signs supersedes any other law in the country. So, well, it's part of the US being turned into a police state. So anyway, that was one thing I thought was interesting. People don't think about the UN. Uh, Another thing that's kind of interesting, not related to the UN, because today, or was it yesterday, uh, the US invaded Grenada, a country which almost nobody had heard of previously. And
1983, right?
yes, in 1983. And Clint Eastwood later made a movie about the invasion of Grenada. I don't know if
I
you saw
didn't
it.
see that.
Yeah, he was, where he played an old Marine and invaded Grenada. What was the name of that movie? Uh, anyway, um, this happened in 1983. And so why would the US invade? I mean, actually sending the Marines and the SEALs and all this kind of stuff into Grenada, and something like 25 US servicemen and, you know, 50 or 60 Grenadan military and a bunch of Cuban advisors and, you know, a few hundred people were killed. And of course, 50 or 60 civilians. It wasn't like a big deal. But what was going on? Do you recall this, the
I
invasion of
was eight
Grenada?
years. I was 8 years old, and I remember seeing it on like ABC. The TV was on at breakfast. I remember seeing about it, but I had no idea. Still don't know what it was for.
Well, what they said the reason was back then was that the Cubans or the Russians were building a big airport in Grenada. Well, the fact is, it's a very mountainous island, and they only had a 5,000 foot or 6,000 foot most runway there. And they were saying that they're building a 10,000 foot runway in Grenada, and Russian Antonovs can land in Grenada. This was the actual argument. And of course, then I remember this because I was in Grenada the year before. There was a whack job. All these communist dictators or wannabe dictators are whack job. His name was Maurice Bishop, and he overthrew the previous whack job that was the president of Grenada. Place went independent from Britain in 1976. And so actually, I was in Grenada a year before, and I was the only face on the island. I know the other reason that Reagan invaded was Grenada was famous, insofar as it's famous, for having these offshore had an offshore medical university, because it was very hard, still is, to get into an American medical school to get medical training. So entrepreneurs set up a medical university in Grenada, and there were a few hundred Americans there. They were in no danger at all. I mean, the whole thing was actually a criminal enterprise, the invasion of Grenada by the U.S. And we replaced, whoever, Bishop with some other idiot. And I got, my kind of claim to fame was on that trip through the Caribbean, where I spent 3 or 4 days in Grenada, and it was very interesting. I had a lot of fun. I was about the only white guy on the island. I really believe I was. I didn't see any other white people anywhere. I went to mob scenes where they were all demonstrating our freedom land, our freedom land. We didn't care. Well, I wasn't the only white guy, because all the students at the medical university were white guys too. They were the casus belli, I guess. Them in the extension of the airport, which was actually necessary if it was going to become a tourist haven, because you couldn't get a big plane in there. And now it is a tourist haven. Anyway, long story. Next place on my shopping list was to go to Dominica, and this is probably too much to talk about. Just talking about current events. I'm going off on a
No, it's good. This is better. If we don't get to the speak of the house, he'll be there for a while.
Yeah. Okay. So anyway, I went to Dominica, and as I always did in those days, when I'd go to a place I hadn't been before, opened up the Yellow Pages, which still existed, and called lawyers and real estate agents who are power centers that know everybody, they have money, and interviewed them. Just had to kill time someplace somehow, and met with this one lawyer, and we got along well. He says, "You want to meet my brother Kenny? He runs the Industrial Development Bank." So he calls up his brother, and we have dinner that night. Makes an appointment for me. This happened all the time when I go to these countries. And we're having dinner, and he's a little suspicious of me. He thinks that maybe I'm an Uhuru jumper, because, small independent country. Now, what am I doing there? And this is where I explained the first time, I explained the early stages of my plan to totally anarchize the country. And I said, listen, you've got lots of spare mountaintops here. There's nothing there, but they're assets, nothing happening there. We'll put one in a public corporation. And if somebody makes a 50, and this was at the time when South Africans and Hong Kong people in particular wanted to get foreign passports, but they couldn't. And I said, and this was my idea. It was my idea. This is original. I'm certain it's original. So I said, we'll put one of your spare mountaintops in a public company, and sell shares in the company. In exchange for making an investment in the company, we'll offer economic citizenship. And I said, we'll sell 1,000 passports, easy citizenship, for $50,000 a piece. That's $50 million. Well, that was big money. That's about 10 times more than he'd ever thought of in his whole life. And he thought about it, and blah, blah, blah. We're talking some more. And I told him, when we take the company public, now we got $50 million in a source of income. We'll take it public in New York and London and Tokyo. And let's say we take it public in $1, and people that are of significant help to the company, a person like yourself, for instance, might get warrants at a penny, maybe $1 million of them. I'm hoping, since he's the director of the Industrial Development Bank, he can do arithmetic. So he thinks about it, and there's a pause for a long time between these two guys that don't know each other. And he says, Mr. Casey, let me go off and call Mrs. Charles, who was the president of the country at that time. I think you should meet with her. And he set up a meeting for me with Eugenia Charles, the president of the country, the next day, and for breakfast. And I said, this is interesting. I've got a tiger by the tail. So anyway, her father was dying, and he died that night. And Kenny calls me back and says, have to cancel the appointment. We got a funeral and all this stuff. So idiotically, I left because I didn't want to hang around for 3 or 4 days while this Caribbean funeral going. And I should have stayed there. And it could have changed the whole course of my life. Anyway, the interesting thing, you're saying, well, how does this relate to Grenada and the invasion of Grenada? I'll tell you how. When the U.S. invades a nothing, nowhere place, they always like a beard. They like somebody to make it look international, coalition of the willing kind of bullshit.
Yeah.
Okay. So they rounded up Eugenia Charles, the woman I was supposed to meet, and she was the actual titular head of the invasion force of Grenada. And Dominica sent along a policeman so that they were part of the invasion force. This is the honest to God truth. So anyway.
How long did it take for Dominica to finally roll out their economic citizenship program?
I don't know. I'll have to research that. And I never went back there because I'm basically lazy to round up Kenny and say, hey, you owe me a free passport because I'm complicit in this scam.
But you could technically
it all turns out to be a scam because all these countries have raised hundreds of millions of dollars actually through this stuff. And they pissed it all away, and all the officials get wealthy, the usual drill.
That's because they didn't have the structure that you suggested. If they would have had that, then it wouldn't allow them to fritter away all that money. It would have been, set up properly.
That's right, because there's a lot more to the structure that I laid out for Kenny, but that's subject for another conversation. We're just talking about current events today. So, what did you mention? You mentioned that the speaker. Right?
Well, actually, but there's a special birthday today. I know it's really important to you that you have to mention.
Oh, yeah. The Encyclopedia Britannica, which loves to keep us informed of celebrities. And politicians are just celebrities. You got singers and actors and politicians whose birthdays are noted. And today, birthday of the day is Hillary Clinton. Was born today in 1947.
Cause for celebration, I think.
It is. She's kind of long in the tooth, and her great desire to be elected president will, I guess, be dashed. I mean, it ain't going to work at this point. Anything happen. I mean, the political situation in the U.S. is so chaotic.
Yeah, I think I'd put Big Mike ahead of Hillary as being the dark horse candidate.
As it were, yes, that's right. I certainly hope that that's a gigantic, world-class, unbelievable scandal that comes out along with about a dozen other that we could name. Oh, and talking about, when I think of Hillary, I think of the Arkancides. I mean, the fact that there were dozens of related people around her and Bill died strange, unnatural deaths, suspicious deaths, which nobody ever talks about. But also the Encyclopedia Britannica mentions that in 1979, President Park Chung-hee, who was the president of South Korea. And for 20 years before, he took it over to get a coup. And like my karate instructor, Mr. Ki-Won Kim, President Park was in the Japanese army in China during World War II. So they probably knew each other. They were the same vintage. But anyway, this is interesting, is that Park, and those of you who are familiar with Korea will recognize almost all Koreans, factually, are either Parks, Kims, or Lees. They almost all are. I mean, the whole country is like related. You look at a phone book of Seoul, and how does anybody find anybody with all Parks, Kims, and Lees? Anyway, Mr. Park, who was a dictator of Korea, but in kind of like the who's the guy that reformed Singapore in roughly the same era? Died, famous.
Will be my tongue.
My tick.
Lee Kuan
Yew.
Yew.
All these names, I mean, have to keep them somewhere in our minds. Crazy. Anyway, he was assassinated by a lifelong boyhood friend who he appointed the head of the Korean CIA, who was a certain Mr. Kim. So Mr. Kim assassinated Mr. Park back then. But these politicians all kill each other, and it's kind of appropriate that, I mean, Hillary probably met him before he was bumped off, and whatever.
Probably. So the Speaker of the House, this new guy, just was, after putting the country through hell for a few weeks with having no Speaker of the House, they finally coalesced around this guy, Mike Johnson from Louisiana. Do you know much about this character?
I read a little bit about him. Before we go into that, though, everybody says this is a disaster. They're going to set the government down. We can't get anything done. But I'd like somebody to explain why it's important that the speaker's there to pass laws and stuff like that. I mean, we don't need more laws. I don't
Exactly.
think.
I mean, the best thing is we actually did not, during this 3-week period, this difficult period, as Mike Johnson described it, where the world started to lose faith in the U.S. and our ability to get to work. Yeah, that's what he said.
The U.S., the world's lost faith in the U.S. for nothing to do with the fact that they don't have a Speaker of the House.
I know, it's crazy. And all they were able to do for his first act, he said, would be to send billions of dollars to war, to Israel in particular.
Yeah, that was the thing. I read what he wants to do and doesn't want to do, and he's basically a Trumper. So he wants to close the border with Mexico. At this point, you have to, because you're going to have millions of people just flowing across the country and giving them cell phones and debit cards, and see you later. I mean, that's crazy. Okay, that's great. And what else does he want to do? He wants to cut off aid to the Ukraine. I said, wonderful. That's great. But then he says he wants to support our friends in Israel to an unlimited, whatever degree.
Yes. And so there's a label I saw on Twitter today, which I'd seen before, but not a long time, but it was trending today, called American Jihad. American Taliban. And that label was ascribed to him and also this person who was allegedly responsible for this mass shooting event. But the reason they say American Taliban is because he is a well-known evangelical Christian. And that is part of that, his belief system, is the undying, always support of Israel above all things, probably because hoping the second coming of Jesus might happen. So the whole idea that this World War III underway and this adding this new, we already have the Jews, one religion, very upset with the Muslims. And we got to make sure the Christians have strong representation in there too now. So it really will be a global holy war, it seems.
Yeah, it's really rather amazing that you wouldn't think that it could get much worse from these horrible people that that become speakers and have immense power within the political apparatus. But apparently, this guy is a maniacal Christian. That's fine. Everybody's got their peccadillos and their religious beliefs. I don't care. But he wants to immanentize the eschaton. And, he probably wants to find a red cow without a single white hair in it. That's was another thing that was going around for a while.
The red heifer. The red heifer.
Red
Yeah.
heifer. Yeah, Christians were looking for red heifers. But this guy impresses me with beliefs like that as being somewhat maniacal and potentially fanatic. Yeah, so they call him American Taliban. See, why would he be American Taliban exactly?
Because he's a religious zealot, I think, and they're trying to connect it to MAGA, what the left calls MAGA fascism.
Yeah. Well, fascism. Yeah. Government hooked up with corporations. Yeah, that's all true. This is what a dog's breakfast this all is. Anyway, I got to believe this is going to end badly with this guy. And of course, he's not somebody that, even though he's head of the branch of government that appropriates things, he wants to give more money to Israel. There's a $2 trillion per year deficit and growing. And nobody talks about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, the good thing, Doug, is there's some economic news today. It said that the GDP grew last quarter at double the rate that it did in Q2. 4.9% is what they say.
Really?
GDP is exploding. I mean, the economy is doing great. I don't know what you're worried about.
I guess the fact that the average guy can't lay his hands on $500 if he has an emergency has nothing to do with any of that. You can't believe any of these numbers. You can't believe anything, frankly, that you read in the current news. It's all spun and it lies.
And this is on at the same time that we have explosive economic growth, apparently, according to GDP stats. They're like $500 billion shy of last year's tax receipt. So just basic, how's that possible? How can the economy be doing, so much better and yet tax receipts be down so substantially?
Well, I don't think with modern monetary theory, which is what they're using, but is not being widely promoted as such with those words. It's basically that you print money instead, or in preference, or in addition to taxing. Taxing, actually, the main function of taxing is to withdraw money that the central bank prints to spread and stimulate the economy. And if inflation gets too bad, you can withdraw money by taxing it away from the people. So the people really don't have anything to do with the economy anymore. It's the people in the Federal Reserve and the Treasury Department to make these decisions. And everybody says, yeah, we can't have that. They're unelected bureaucrats. Well, what does being elected have anything to do with anything? I mean, it's like if they're elected, it's okay what they do.
Right.
The Fed isn't elected. The Supreme Court's not elected. Who gives a damn? It's got nothing to do. Elections have nothing to do with the free country. This is all just cosmetic bullshit is all it is, frankly.
Theater, just theater, seems like. Keep the people distracted.
Anyway, so we have a new speaker, and I can't wait to see. This is comedy. It should be viewed as a soap opera.
What I don't know if you saw, did you see his first speech? Did you watch that?
No, I didn't.
Okay. I'll send it to you because it's such bullshit. And he's talking about how basically not only are people in government ordained by God, but he specifically in that role is ordained by God.
No, that's dangerous. So perhaps the meme American Taliban is not so far off because we're talking about Mohammedan religious fanatics that run Afghanistan at this point.
Right. And so they're taking this label and then they're this weird mass shooting. And it just, as I watching this unfold, the news of this mass shooting last night in Maine, I just reminded of your book, the most recent in your series, Assassin. It just seems like, it just reminded me of what was happening in that book. Cause there's a shooting that occurs out of nowhere. The guy's actually apparently very skilled, kills a lot of people. but he's disappeared all of a sudden, like person did in your book?
Yeah, I hope that John Hunt and I get around to writing the number 4 Charles Knight novel, which ramps up Assassin much further, which is called Terrorist. But events are outrunning a science fiction novel. In point of fact, that's what's going on today. And it's kind of scary.
Well, I mean, that American Taliban theme fits perfectly well with that next book.
Yeah, I hope that reality doesn't track my novels too closely.
It's Doug.
Not,
It's if you
not,
the last
not going
one
to
was
end well.
shocking. It's not-
I know. Well, perhaps this is a proof that we really do live in a giant matrix, a construct, you know. And as a
yeah,
solipsist, we've talked about that in the past. Someone who, in his heart of hearts, believes that this is all just a something that's going on in our collective consciousness. It's not real. It's too stupid to be real.
yeah, but so much of it's mirrored your books so closely that maybe you're responsible for all this, Doug. I should start blaming you. Think more positively.
Well, I think that last thing, think more positively. I think you're right about that, because if you predict gloom and doom occurs, the hoi polloi, the Capodicensi, inevitably, it seems, blame the guy that predicted it. Hey, it's his fault, you know? So I better tone it down or get out of the country at this point. Fortunately, anything that we do or say is not even a rounding error. So that's,
It's totally wrong.
I got to look at the bright side.
Did you have any feelings about this mass shooting yesterday? Anything? I don't know if you've seen much about it. Anything jump out at you?
Well, how many people were killed?
I've seen different reports on this. That's one of the things that's so strange about it, is that the range of information is pretty broad. At one point, I saw there were maybe up to 60 that were injured. Today, the number I saw that was reported on Twitter by apparently the governor of Maine said that there were 18 killed and 13 injured, which that doesn't make much sense because usually there's a lot more injured than killed, but pretty high numbers compared to normal.
Yeah, because what I saw earlier was 26 killed and 60 injured. But who knows? Well, who's the alleged perpetrator?
His name is Robert Card, 40 years old. He was, I think he's in the Army Reserves, served active duty for a while, never in a war zone or anything. Apparently he was a firearms instructor. And over the summer, he had some mental breakdown of some kind, and he was institutionalized for a couple of weeks, saying he was hearing voices in his head, a very MK Ultra like, by the way, hearing voices in his head that he should shoot up some military training facility.
Well, it'll add fuel to the fire to illegalize guns of all sorts. He was a white guy, undoubtedly, of course, but did he shoot white people, black people, any particular group?
Not mentioned yet, but from what I hear, there's a couple people I follow on Twitter who are from Maine and live very close to that town. Drive through. One guy drives through it twice a day, and he said it's very surprising to him that thing happened there for a couple of reasons. One, he said there's a huge number of migrants that have moved into that area recently, and also there are a lot of people that carry, that are armed, and that there wasn't any. He was really shocked to hear that there wasn't any, pushback from anyone not carrying it all.
Well, if we find out more, my first reaction is to believe anything I hear.
Yes, good rule.
But I'd like to hear about it just because it's soap opera. It's a fun story, and see what the narrative that gets spun and accepted is.
Yeah, it does. It does seem like though it does fall, whether it's no matter what happened, it'll be clearly used by the state as justification, maybe to take firearms, or if nothing else, to foment fear, or the idea that the MAGA is really, the feds are right to be watching Trump supporters because they're really a great risk to the democracy or whatever. So it'll be spun badly no matter what.
Yeah, and of course, MAGA or Trump supporters are about half the country. So, I mean, about, it wasn't so many years ago. I know we had at least one or two podcasts, and I wrote a lot about the potential for a civil war in the U.S. I think that potential's still here. And I hasten to add, it wouldn't be our second civil war, because the war between the states was not a, technically speaking, a civil war at all. The Revolutionary War, oddly enough, was actually more of a civil war. So all these conflated and misused verbs and nouns. Anyway, there was one important thing that I can think of that, well, a couple other things that were, I think, important that happened today. One was that in 1970, Muhammad Ali was able to re-enter boxing. What do you
And why was he kicked out of boxing?
Huh?
Why was he kicked out of boxing?
Well, this is shocking and disgusting. It's because he was the U.S. government attempted to draft him, and Ali said, "I'm not going," and gave a lot of good reasons why he wasn't going to allow himself to be drafted. So the boxing council, or whatever it is, said, "We're going to take your title away from you," which has nothing to do with the fact that that Ali was taking a moral stance, a political stance. What's that have to do with the fact that he was the best boxer in the world? I don't know why do you take, what right do they have to take that away from him? I mean, it's disgusting.
Well, it shows that cancellation is not new.
No, it's not due. And that's right. And of course, in those days, it was more acceptable to cancel a black man, which you dare not do today. Anyway, I'm all on. I've always been all for Ali, almost in everything he's done. So anyway, that happened today. He got back into boxing. And the last thing that I saw in the Encyclopedia Britannica, they notified today, in 1958, the Boeing 707 had its first commercial flight. And I think that's something of really huge historic importance, because
What?
go ahead.
I was say, well, why was it significant? Yeah.
Well, because it changed the nature of travel around the world. When I first went to Europe in 1966, I took an ocean liner from New York to Liverpool, because even then, flying was kind of unusual. I mean, transatlantic flying was unusual. And the Boeing and the 707 had only started, what, 58, 7 years before, or something like that. And there weren't that many planes flying. And now you've got, the whole world revolves around air travel, jet travel. And that first flight in 1958 connected the whole world up. I mean, it was like a major change in civilization, almost as major as, well, the internet, actually.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, because what the internet is to talking and seeing and looking and communicating, the jet plane, because it costs so much and increased speed so much, was to physical communication what the internet was to non-physical communication. So it was a very big deal back then. And, back then, when you flew at all, even if it was on a turboprop plane before that, the stewardesses all wore, they were all young and good looking and wore white gloves and passed out cigarettes to people.
And they were nurses, right?
That's right. When commercial air flight first started, during World War II, my mother was a stewardess for United Airlines during the war. Back when you had to be young, which they don't have to be anymore, good looking, which they don't have to be anymore, and registered nurses, which they definitely don't have to be anymore. So it was a big deal. It was an adventure for a young woman who wanted to, get out of her little town back then. Now they're just, not to insult anybody, but let's admit it. You're a flying waitress with some additional training.
Well, it's even worse than that, I think, now, because after COVID, they became somehow the relationship between the flight attendant and the passenger shifted, where they became, rather than a service person, they became an enforcer more. And it just, to me, the whole tone changed since then.
Changed totally. And maybe that's somewhat related to the fact that all the air, well, they're not called stewardesses anymore because half of them are gay guys, flight attendants are all members of the Teamsters Union, for God's sake. I mean, who would have thought that the stewardesses will one day become Teamsters? Because that's the union, I understand,
That's unbelievable.
or is on top of whatever little union they have. It's crazy.
Well,
Anyway.
Traveling isn't what it was even 5 years ago, and I can't imagine what it must have been like in 1958. But it would be, I'm sure, first class at least.
Yeah, I think a lot of our listeners might remember the before times, before all kinds of things changed.
That's half the reason why I like doing this Encyclopedia Britannica segment, because it's easy to lose track of what was before. Most people don't have a good understanding of history. I know I have a lot to learn, but it's good to know the way it was.
Yeah. Yeah, I like retro rocking because people forget these things with the news cycle driving on every day or two, or maybe a week at most.
Exactly.
But perhaps if our new Speaker of the House, along with, the Israelis and the Palestinians and all these other awful people, immanentize the eschaton, this will all be academic. We'll be grubbing for roots and berries in the next week.
I think so. You know what? Actually, I saw, what's that guy, the nomad capitalist guy, Andrew Henderson. I saw a video of his today where he finally admitted, or he came to the conclusion that because of the, fairly reasonable risk of World War III, that Uruguay looked like one of the best spots in the world.
Yeah, I think it is. And let's hope Argentina also becomes, it's still an excellent place. If Milei he's neck and neck with this horrible Peronist Massa, but I think it's the 19th of November. There's going to be a runoff between the two of them. And we'll see if an actual anarcho-capitalist can be formally elected in a major country.
It would be a catalyst for a lot of things, I think, if it happens.
Yeah, it could be. And of course, the deep state in Argentina is at least as ugly as that in the U.S. And will he be able to do anything or go anywhere? But anyway, that's coming up pretty soon. Major historical event. Nobody's talking about it yet. We'll see what happens.
They also compare him, they say he's far right, and they compare him to Donald Trump somehow. In the American media. It's so weird.
I don't know if it's ignorance or malevolence. Probably it's both, actually, on the part of the people who write stuff and the talking heads on television.
I think you're right. Okay, well, we'll leave it there for today. Doug, we'll be back tomorrow with some viewer questions and answers. And I'm sure we'll also probably have, given the news cycle right now, we'll have more information, at least on this active shooter situation. And who knows, we might be, maybe even Israel will be in Gaza by then. I don't know. Lots happening.
Which is not going to be a happy event from many points of view. I can't wait to find out. I can't wait to hear what I'm told.
Exactly. That's right. We have no idea. All right. Well, thank you very much, Doug. I appreciate it. Talk to you soon.
Thanks,